welcome to More Christ. Today I'm joined by Jonathan Pageau. Jonathan carves Eastern Orthodox and other traditional images. He also designs products, teaches, and makes fantastic videos that explore how ancient patterns can re-enchant our contemporary life. Just to begin then today, Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit, please, about your background and some of the key events in your life that helped to form you and your love for Christ and his church?
Well, my parents, I come from Quebec, which used to be the most Catholic place in the world, pretty much. You know, the Vatican had secret plans to move here if Mussolini won the war. That's how Catholic it was. And so in the 60s, like it happened all over in the 60s, late 60s, there was a kind of revolution. We call it the Quiet Revolution, where everything changed and people started fleeing the church en masse. My parents in that moment converted to kind of evangelical Christianity. And they did it out of a real, authentic desire to follow Christ. They felt like the church was, that the Catholic Church was empty and superstitious, and that it was just a veneer of Christianity. And so I grew up in that world where my father was actually a Baptist pastor, recently converted from Catholicism in a church full of people converted from Catholicism. So I grew up both with a very strong love of Christ and a very dedicated church because it was all new, it was all young, but also a kind of virulent anti-Catholicism, which was really very present in the church because everybody who was there basically had converted from Catholicism. And so it was a very Puritan form of Christianity where no crosses, no bells, no liturgical calendar. We barely celebrate Christmas. We barely celebrate Easter. Some people didn't even celebrate Christmas. That's how Puritan it was. And so that's what I grew up in. My parents weren't extreme at all. My father is actually a very thoughtful and wonderful person. But it was mostly just the circumstances and the culture in which I was growing up. But I was quite content. I met amazing people, really dedicated Christians. I've never had the bad kind of personal experiences that people feel, that sometimes lead them away from the church. I had very good experiences with very God-loving people. But in my 20s, I really felt like there was something missing, and there was a kind of superficiality to the faith, and it led me in a kind of spiritual crisis. And the crisis was also born in my art because I knew I was going to be a visual artist quite young, but there was a kind of let's say, an unsaid hostility towards the visual arts. It wasn't explicit, but it was implicitly suspicious because of their Puritan background. And so I tried to deal with that in university. What does it mean to be a Christian and make art? What does it mean to be Christian and make contemporary art, because I was in a world of kind of contemporary theory, postmodernism, all of that stuff, being really faced with that. And all of it really led me into a crisis, which ended up also being a crisis of faith. So my brother and I, all at the same time, my brother who now has written a book on symbolism, we both kind of went through that crisis at the same time, exploring spiritual traditions, reading all kinds of weird stuff like you do in your early 20s. And then luckily, I came upon the church fathers, and a lot of the mysteries I was looking for, a lot of I would say the kind of worldview that I was hoping to find in these kind of weird esoteric texts or these Eastern traditions, I really found in St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Maximus the Confessor. And my brother, he found more in kind of rabbinical studies. And we realized that what we were looking for, this really integrated vision of the world, this kind of cosmic vision of that wasn't just like a faith on top of a scientific materialism, but that was really this vision of the world that went, from the highest to the lowest, that held the world together, was already there in Christianity. It's just that I had never been in contact with it. And so in discovering St. Gregory of Nyssa and the church fathers in general, and then also discovering kind of the great medieval synthesis in terms of art, in terms of architecture, in terms of this liturgical experience, which fills, all aspects of life, from, like I said, from time to space, to the way people identify themselves. I really fell in love with that language. And I realized that it was just the language that was already there in scripture, but borne out in time and space, in music and poetry and in visual images. And so having kind of realized that language wasn't really still living, or I wasn't as prominent in the Western tradition, I was slowly kind of guided. I was slowly kind of, by little steps and little miracles and little surprises, I was led into the Orthodox Church, where the church fathers that I love so much, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Maximus, St. Ephraim the Syrian, are central in terms of the cosmology and the way that things still are. So that's kind of what led me to where I am, to becoming an icon carver, to becoming someone who's interested in symbolism and, these symbolic patterns which we find in scripture and in art. That kind of what brings it together.
Yeah, wonderful. And then were there any persons that were especially inspirational or influential along the way in that journey? Close to you?
Well, I would say for sure the church fathers I named were the closest to me. There are a few people along my journey, I would say, before I really discovered the church fathers, which are part of it. Like, this is going to be surprising to some, but Jacques Derrida had a huge influence on me in college. And he was actually my first contact with apophatic thinking. Because people don't know his thought very well, he wrote a little book called Save the Name, in which he did a reading of the Cherubinic Wanderer, which is a 17th century kind of negative theology. And that really struck me. I never heard anything like it. Like, I never had any sense of this notion of beyond being, or this idea of the infinite as beyond the nameable, and so that had a massive impact on me. And also the taking down of the modern hegemony, like, let's say the kind of scientific materialist hegemony of discourse was kind of broken down for me by postmodern thinkers, and I still am thankful for them for doing that today. But it wasn't enough. And there's another writer, his name is René Guénon, who's a traditionalist, who is also kind of part of my journey, because he, when you read him as a 20-year-old who's kind of wondering what's going on, like, his writing is like razor blades. He just slashes everything. And so if you get through his writing, you have a completely different worldview. But like I said, again, I thought a lot of his stuff is weird and it's not kind of off key, but he was part of the people that led me towards the church. And then finally, Vladimir Lossky, who's a 20th century Russian theologian, Russian immigrant to France, his work just blew me away. It was just because you could see in the way that he wrote and the word that he used, he was trying to use even some a language that would appeal to kind of Westerners who had a sensibility to spirituality, let's say. And he was trying to use words to help them understand what the Orthodox tradition was about. And it really affected me quite a bit. By the time I walked into an Orthodox church, I was already convinced. It was just formality by then.
Amazing. That's eerily familiar to my own story. I guess I can touch upon going on and stuff like that later on too. But I want to look at then some of your work on YouTube as an icon carver and with things like the Orthodox Arts Journal and more besides that. So perhaps we can begin with your recent conversation with Jonathan Peterson and your wonderful friendship with him. And our mutual friend Paul van der Klee has said that we can see here just how close you guys actually are, and that you take each other's work very seriously. It's a really beautiful thing to witness. So he's contrasted it with other chats which different high status people have, who are maybe more unfamiliar with each other's work because of time constraints and different things, I suppose. But it's just not the same, I don't think, is what comes across in your conversation. So can you share maybe one or two reflections in that discussion and why you think it resonated with so many people?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think it's like Jordan Peterson and I don't know, I wouldn't say we're super close in the sense of a deep friendship that is, I would say that when we encountered each other in 2015, it was obvious that we were in the same field together, and we recognized each other as being very similar in terms of thought patterns and in terms of approach and sensibilities. And so in that way, we really connected very quickly. And so I would say we became friends rather quickly. But then he became world famous. Like I had, when I talked to him then, I hadn't talked to him in 2 years, I think, or maybe even a little more. And I think that Jordan's authenticity, I think, is really transparent, and that really touches people. That he is not afraid to show his struggle, his doubts, that he is also in a situation of deep suffering, I think really resonated with people. And I think it also, to see him teetering on the verge of seeing this mystery, of seeing the mystery of the incarnation, resisting but being tempted, and everybody could kind of feel that hesitation and temptation in him. I think that's why it really connected with so many people. In a way, he is kind of manifesting this moment, which is that there's a large amount of young people who had been told that Christianity is just stupid, silly superstition. And now, through a series of completely surprising events, through Jordan Peterson, but through these movements in cognitive science and these different things that are going on, have suddenly found themselves strangely capable of understanding what it's about and connecting to it on a personal level. And so there are hundreds of thousands of young people that are kind of standing in the position that Jordan Peterson is standing. And some of them even watch him hesitate, and in that hesitation gives them the courage to step forward and to kind of move more than Jordan is even willing to do. And so I think that's what's going on.
Yeah, marvelous. And then personally for you, then what have you most enjoyed about the kind of wild journey that really kicked off with Jordan since he blew up?
Well, it's been really a surprise. I didn't expect this. I've been working on all these symbolic ideas for years. I mean, since I was in my early 20s, and I'd written about this kind of symbolism a little bit in the Orthodox Art Journal, since we started it in 2012. But to be honest, I almost never talked about this stuff, just because I felt like nobody would even understand what the subject is. Not only understand what I'm, the specifics, but even the frame. And so what happened is that Jordan kind of blew those doors open. And all of a sudden, I found myself surprised to have people that can not only understand what I'm talking about, but deeply resonate and be willing to kind of jump in and engage into this rediscovery with me. And so I think that that's really been the most exciting thing, is that I don't feel alone in that world anymore. And there's, I would say maybe like about 1,000 people that are really involved, that are posting, that are just kind of involved in the discussion, participating in the comment section, but also on Facebook and these groups. And to me, that's the most exciting. And I'm trying hard now to get the cream of the crop of those people to now get involved more, which is why we have a blog on the website now. And, people have their own channels. And so I'm trying to kind of go on people's channels as well to try to create this sense that this is more than just me. It's not about me. It really is something which is happening, a movement which is taking place.
Yeah, magnificent. Thank God for that. And I do love the central emphasis that you place on Theosis and Jordan when he talks about the call to adventure in Christ and things like that. That was one of the first things that really caught me and set me on fire with the Christian theodrama and the beauty of iconography. So it's funny you mentioned Lasky. He was very formative in me becoming a Christian as well. Just regarding Jordan then, as a friend and someone that you have been on the same wavelength with in some ways, what would you like to see next for him then?
I mean, it's not hard to know what I would like. I mean, I have had the joy of watching his wife Tammy move very much closer to Christianity and find a great relief and joy in that movement. And so, I really hope that Jordan will find the place in him, find that spot in him where he can recognize Christ and kind of enter into a communion, like actually enter into the body of Christ. I think that to me, I think that he's kind of at that door. I mean, he might never make that move, but it's obviously, I think that's what I would would hope. So
yeah, God willing. And as you say, he's certainly acting as kind of Moses figure, kind of like C.S. Lewis, even though he led people to the Catholic Church, he led people to Christianity in general. And it's great. So you personally I've managed to draw young people into the Christian story, as I was mentioning with you before, at schools in London. And I'm most grateful for what you're doing in that respect, and exploring films and things like Logan to Batman and beyond. If you pardon that, almost a pun there. Why then is the medium of film so helpful for you in opening people who are maybe outright secularists and even lukewarm Christians up to the symbolic world and the Christian story?
Well, I mean, if you want to know where our stories are right now, that's mostly where they are. They are in film, on TV shows. And so once you understand the pattern, let's say, or once you kind of live in the pattern of the Bible and the pattern of Christ, then you realize that that's really what the world is made of. And so it's once you I don't know how to say this, once you kind of get it, now it's just a matter of like, how much energy do you have to put your attention on different things in order to talk about them? So once that spotlight gets shone on one or thing or another, then it reveals itself in that pattern. So I knew that talking about movies would be a way for people to quickly understand what I'm talking about, and also help people understand, because people are so alienated by religion, and I understand why. There's so many reasons why that happened, but it seemed to me like one of the best places to help people see that this is talking about reality. Like, this isn't just an arbitrary thing you have to believe to go to heaven or whatever, or all this kind of nonsense. It really is a description of reality. And I want to find ways, any way possible, to help you see that it's actually talking about reality. So if I can give you the key to a movie that you love, or to a TV series, or to something that you connect with, if I can give you a key and surprise you with that key, a good example would be like that Batman video I did, where I show people that the story of Batman traces onto the Garden of Eden, which is something people wouldn't necessarily think. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Yeah. You're right. Once you've seen it, it's like that's it. You've seen it. And so that's the kind of thing that I was hoping to do, is to kind of provoke this change of thinking.
Yeah, that's magnificent. And one of my favorites was the Logan one. You touched upon the ascent up the mountain, animality, the gowns of skin, and really landed St. Gregory of Nyssa for people like me. I want to ask you next then, kind of essentially, how does what you're doing differ from, say, what Joseph Campbell talked about, or even Jordan and his more Darwinian and archetypal approach?
So I think that, like, this is something that people maybe can criticize me about, but my understanding of Joseph Campbell and Jung and all of them is that they really want to place the pattern in the psyche, the human psyche, and see it as the pattern of the human psyche. And so the idea that this is your pattern of as a human person, this is kind of the story that you engage in. And if you engage on that story, then you will find a type of fulfillment. My contention is much bigger than that. My contention is that this pattern is the pattern of attention itself. It's the pattern, and because it's the pattern of attention, it ends up being the way in which the world lays itself out. Just that. And so it's not just only in your own personal stories. It's in every single thing you can recognize as having unity. Any perception of unity in the world will follow the pattern of the mountain, the pattern, that is in the beginning of Scripture. And so I think that maybe is the difference. And it takes a while for people to kind of get that that's what I'm talking about, because it's not just about psycholization. It is the psychological part is there, but it's not just that. It's actually much more than that. And so it's like, it's the pattern of a story is also the pattern of a city, the pattern of a family, is the pattern of a house, it's the pattern of all these things. And in a way, I think that Jordan, is surprisingly enough, comes closer to what I'm saying. But I also believe, and you can see it a little bit in my conversation with him, that I think he doesn't go to the end of his own theory. Like, he doesn't completely acknowledge or live in the conclusion of his own theory. And so you can see in my conversation with him where he says, do you think that the narrative level and the objective level meet? And my answer is to remind him of the things he's said himself, which is that not only can they meet, but they inevitably meet. And there's no other way for reality to exist except they meet, because every act of perception implies a hierarchical pattern. And so it implies the good. To notice anything is to already evaluate it. You're always evaluating. And so because you're evaluating, you're always aiming. You're always aiming towards the good. And that aim, that's the mountain. That's the pyramid. That's all those patterns that are, it's the pyramid. It's the pattern of your own perception. If you stand there and you notice that on the edge of your perception, everything is hazy, and whatever it is you focus on becomes clear, it's like, that's it. That's the pattern. And so I think that that's the difference. But I think, I don't know, it's like, that's the thing that I'm always trying to convince Jordan of, but you can see that it shatters. Sometimes it's shattering for some reason for him. So he said at the end of the conversation, he said, there's so much I can handle talking to you. It's like, there's just so much I can handle talking to you, which he had said even at the outset before we started recording. I noticed he was weird, and I thought, "Are you nervous?" He said, "Yes, I'm nervous." And I said, "Why are you nervous?" He said, "Well, because I know what we're going to be talking about." And so I think that, so I think that would be the difference with what I'm presenting.
Yeah, that's most interesting. Thank you, Jonathan. I hadn't really foresaw this question at the moment, but I don't know if you want to kind of go down this route or move on. But is there a difference then? So Rabbi Jonathan Sacks used to talk about the meaning of the system lies outside of the system, and then obviously we're coming from a small O Orthodox understanding, at the very least, that God is outside of the cosmos itself, or the universe or the multiverse, and reveals himself through these patterns and things like that. Whereas, I guess, is Jordan following that kind of secular age immanent frame where the unconscious and conscious things all come together, but it is within the human memory, and it's still a self-enclosed system that is Darwinian and plays a longer game, but is still a kind of form of Kantianism or something like that. Does that make sense?
Maybe. I don't know. Like, I don't know if that's the hiccup with Jordan. And so, but in a way, I think that Jordan understands that all things point beyond themselves, like they just do. And so, it's like, I don't like saying God is outside of the system. I rather like saying that God is, let's say, beyond the system and contains it. Like, the system is in God. There's nothing outside of God. Like, there is no outside of God. And so I think that he understands that things point beyond themselves, but I don't know if he understands also what that involves, let's say. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. Yeah, that's a good, nice insight. And I'd love to hear a bit more about your experiences with people like Guénon and the Perennialist School. I had a somewhat chaotic background dabbling with, say, Sanatan Dharma, Sufi Islam, stuff like that.
Yeah.
What is good and bad in some of those persons now, looking back on it as a Christian?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I mean, I think what's good about the Perennialists, especially in my opinion, Guénon, is that Guénon is a great tool against the modern illusion. I mean, he's the best tool. If you read A Crisis of the Modern World, it smashes. If you read that with an open mind, it will smash so many of your presuppositions about modern reality and its accomplishments, let's say. So I think that I don't know if there's anybody better at doing that than he did. The Reign of the Quantity is just a ruthless book. I even warn people, I say, don't, be careful. Like, you read that, it can drive you crazy, because it's like, if I smash your worldview, I can leave you teetering. I've seen people reading those. I've seen people reading, become insane, like become paranoid and become like just weirdly paranoid, because it really does smash something which is holding the world together. So I think that that's still what's good about the work, in the sense that we need that, especially if you're like in your 20s and you're exploring and you have a lot of space and time to think, then it can really be helpful. I think that the negative part of the work is that what ended up happening, and I don't know if that's what Guénon wanted. Well, first of all, there's a lot of remainder of weird occult stuff in his work. Just like, you can imagine, like Origen, he fought the Gnostics so much that he was tainted by them, and I think that that's something you see in Guénon as well. He remained a Martinist his whole life, and he had let's say suspicious relations, let's say, and so I think that that's one part. And then the second part is that what ends up happening with perennialists, and this is something I've seen, especially in the kind of Chouon type perennialist, is that they don't realize that they're participating in the breakdown of the world. They don't realize that they are actually they are fueling the kind of New Age mush and New Age breakdown that they themselves oppose, because the perennialists act as if they stand above all these religions, and we're wondering, like, where are you standing? Like, they stand above these religions, and then they look upon the religions, and then they compare and contrast them, and they point to all these different things as examples of the transcendent principles, but they do so in a way that ends up being almost like another religion. It's almost as if it's a religion in itself. And they obviously would deny this. They would say that's not what they're doing, but that's the result that it ends up causing. And it fuels the universalist mush, like the kind of, I believe in the universalist thing, therefore I'm nothing. And I've seen it happen. And I really do think that that's a serious problem, and that it leads to it's fueling the chaos, and it's fueling weird things. Like, it's fueling weird things like the idea of, it's fueling the opposite of what Guénon said. Like, the perennialists seem to be somehow part of globalization. Like, there seemed to be a perennialist thread in kind of this globalized culture, and this idea of a one world government, one world this. There seems to be some perennialists that are in that thing. Like, Prince Charles is a good example of that, where Prince Charles is obviously a perennialist, but keeps talking in these weird globalist terms that are weird and surprising. And he speaks as if he is, again, above and appreciates Islam and appreciates Christianity and appreciates all these different traditions, as if he's floating above all of this. And so that's the problem with perennialism. And I don't see an easy solution about it.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. And what then are some of the lessons that maybe we should take away from the fact that people like us really look to these figures before we actually turn to our own Christian riches then?
Well, I mean, it's just like anything on the way that can feed you, in the sense that I think truth is truth. You get the truth wherever you can get it. I always tell people that, like, I don't think that, I don't like people who tell me something like a good example is Origen. It's like, okay, so Origen said some heretical things, but then people, if you quote Origen, or if you make a gesture towards him, or if you've read something in his book, then all of a sudden you're suspicious. Like, no, Origen said a lot of amazing things, a lot of amazing, insightful, powerful things, so much so that the fathers you love are the ones who published his books. And so, but there are things that he said that are wrong, and let's point to those things. And I think it's fair that he's not a saint, and all of these things I think are fair, but it's the same for everybody. And so whatever Guénon said, which is true, I think is fine to recognize. And whatever he said that's not true, there is problematic, I think it's fine to just set aside, because I don't identify with them. It's actually easy. It's like, if I read, it's harder for things that I actually identify with. So if let's say, I don't know, if St. Basil the Great says something problematic, it's actually more of a difficulty for me than if Guénon says something problematic, because I'm not in his body. Like, I'm not in a body with him. Like, he's like a spice on the side that I can kind of sprinkle on, and I can really see insight into, but I don't feel like I have to follow him in any way. And so I think that that's the way that I approach all these thinkers. Like, I still have insight from Jacques Derrida or different, or Heidegger, for example. Like I get a lot of insight from Heidegger, but I'm not going to spend my time talking about Heidegger. And so that's the thing. It's like what I tend to talk about things, let's say, through Christ, and then once in a while I'll mention this as an example, something odd or something off as an example, just to help people see that this is a universal pattern and it appears all over. And I think it's the same for other traditions. I think it's like sometimes you encounter Christians that weirdly talk about other religions more than they talk about their own Christianity, because they want to show, like they constantly want to show how these other religions are okay, but it ends up making a weird upside down thing. But I think it's fine to once in a while say, oh, Ibn Arabi said this very powerful, thoughtful thing, or like in the Bhagavad Gita, there's this interesting idea that is worth considering. But I do so not as it not being my own, right? It's not my thing. It's something I'm pointing to on the outside, let's say.
And then kind of internal to Christianity. I don't really like that word, but we'll go with it anyway for our purposes. So what is it that's missing in the West, developed in the West, as it were, that isn't landing with people? So even from my own perspective, whenever I was growing up, it really never landed with me, because is this conception of Jesus as a kind of weakling and he's on the cross bleeding. It doesn't contextualize the whole story. So whenever I discovered Losky and people like that, I was drawn to the Christus Victor model of atonement, for example, as primary, I should say, not exclusive. So I can really appreciate people's lack of zest in that respect. And I want to ask sort of how figures like St. Maximus the Confessor, for example, bring us back to that cosmic drama, and how do they help us to see the patterns of reality laying themselves out in ways that transcend our dominant secularist frames?
Yeah. Well, I think the one of the big problems has been moralism, the reduction of Christianity to morality in terms of and obviously there is a difficulty of the notion of sin, also of understanding sin mostly in a kind of moral offense type of thing. The idea of we've offended God, we've offended, and what it does is there's a sense in which all of this is kind of arbitrary. And it's still there. I think a lot of the potential of integrating it all together is still there, but somehow it's as if some of the threads aren't connected together. But when you read someone like St. Maximus, then you really understand that this is first and foremost like a metaphysical vision. It's first and foremost, this is the pattern of reality. It's not arbitrary. I can explain it to you in a way, like I always kind of joke that if I can't say what I'm saying to a secular person, like I haven't said anything. If when I say it, it just sounds completely ridiculous. And, so when you tell people like you've done bad things and you deserve to go to hell, but then God sent Jesus to die for your sins, and if you believe that, then you'll go to heaven. Like, to me, that doesn't mean anything anymore. That doesn't mean anything. It's a complete whitewash. But I mean, the thing is that how can I say this? It's like, on the one hand, I say that, but I can also understand because it is still the story of Christ. And so it can still connect with people in a kind of weird, intuitive or, surprising way. But I think that presenting things that way really is pulling the meaning out of it. And so I would much rather use this, the Athanasius's incarnational vision of the world, and seeing Christ as this idea of assuming things and embodying them and taking them into God by descending into them, let's say. So the descent of God into death becomes something much more than just, a place for the wrath of God to find its let's say. And the vision, for example, of the vision of hell as the love of God, which you see in the Syrian fathers, for example, is extremely convincing. And it's a very powerful way of explaining that. And And I think it's not just Orthodox, because to be honest, like I was reading C.S. Lewis, and it's like it's all there in C.S. Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
Like C.S. Lewis gets it very deeply in terms of understanding what hell is and what it means to suffer because of your sins. And so that's really been the way I've been trying to present it. It's, first of all, understand that this is really talking about reality. It's not an arbitrary thing you need to believe to get saved. It's an actual description of the world, and it's a way you can participate in the world that will save you, in the sense that it will heal you from your passions. It will heal you from, your nihilism. It'll do all that. So.
Yeah, marvelous. And funny enough that you mentioned that, my friend Lou Marcus, one of the guys that was with me for the talk that Jordan Peterson retweeted, he is extremely good on Lewis and his views on hell and things like that. And he was Orthodox, and he's now an evangelical. It's like,
Interesting.
So I want to ask you next then about our dominant scientism, if we might call it that, and how might people maybe on the margins come to see through that as a crude story, say with the likes of Pinker's naivete, which I think you pointed out nicely in your critique?
Well, it's really the science of consciousnit, which is helping people understand this, or the science of perception. And I think as an artist, I come to it so intuitively, because it when you're an artist and you make an image, you realize that you have to synthesize what you're looking at, because there's too much of what you're looking at. And then once you realize that you have to do that for an image, you're actually realizing that you're doing it in your mind all the time. So the idea is that the world has too much stuff in it. That's pretty much it. The world is indefinite in detail. It scales all the way up and it scales all the way down to quantum possibility. And so because of that, in order for you to even notice anything, there has to be a reason for you to notice something. That categories are bound up in reason, that there's a meaning for them. And that if I consider things and I put them in hierarchies of importance, and I have to, or else I would bump my knee into the table if I didn't have a hierarchy of importance. Like I would eat dirt. We all have this irony. We have a natural hierarchy of importance. And that hierarchy of importance is what precedes the scientific world. It precedes scientific perception. That is, you need a reason to look at something for it to then become a category that you can analyze. So science doesn't give you the categories. And it doesn't give you any category, actually. It can only analyze pre-existing categories. It can only give you, and it does it very well. It can describe it, it can quantify, it can predict, it can even help you reproduce an identity, but it doesn't give you the identity ever. Identities are already given. And the place from which that comes is the very deep structure of being that we participate in through meaning. It's the revenge of Aristotle. It's the revenge of Plato. It's like all of a sudden you realize that when Aristotle talked about potentiality and the connection between the actual and the potential, it's like that's actually how the world exists. Like it really does exist that way, because the in front of you is a field of, it's like an indefinite field of potentiality, and you have to constrain it in order to engage with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Jonathan. And is there also the problem that baked into a lot of those conceptions, you have this myth of progress that is taken as an axiom, as it were, which I think you see in liberal types like Pinker, like Sam Harris, and so on. And that notion of progress doesn't make any sense to me.
Doesn't make any sense. Well, because it's hilarious. The progress is the funniest thing in the modern world. It's one of the biggest, most hilarious thing for scientific materialists, because progress, it takes for granted a telos. There's no way around that. For you to progress, you have to be progressing towards something. But if you tell me that there is no telos in the world, then I don't understand even what you're talking about. And what happens with these people, with Sam Harris and Pinker and Weinstein, is that they have a moral structure. And it's given to them exactly in the way that I'm saying. It's given to them. It precedes their perception, but they don't have the capacity to notice that. And the thing is that most people don't, and it's fine. Like most people don't, like, you know, the regular people you find on the street, they can't perceive their given moral pattern. They can't perceive it. And it's actually probably better that they can't, you know, it's like most people shouldn't be able to do that. But if you're the guy attacking moral precepts, if you're the guy attacking spiritual reality, if you're the guy who's mocking ritual and who's mocking the idea that there are these deep patterns in the world, yet you're acting with a given invisible to you set of moral patterns, then I have no patience. Like I get really impatient with that stuff.
Yeah, in line with what you're saying there too, I think from my experience, this kind of liberal seems to think that the Enlightenment ideals are all still fine, and because it's failed doesn't mean that it can't succeed. It's like the kind of that wasn't really socialism myth. And I don't think that things like in line with what Tom Holland, for example, talks about, things like human rights make sense ultimately if they're just going to steal a part of the Judeo-Christian story. The difference, I think, between Siedentop in his book and say Ivan Illich, who's really powerful in deconstructing some of this stuff, as David Cayley describes in his article too. Would you like to speak a bit to that and the mistakes involved in that kind of dominant ideological faith that they have?
Yeah. Well, Tom Holland's Dominion book is amazing. It's really astounding because there's some parts of that book that there's some mischief in it. Like you can see Tom Holland as being very mischievous, because one of the figures that appears right at the outset of the Enlightenment is the Marquis de Sade. And oh my goodness, like Steven Pinker wouldn't like to talk about that guy. And what happens is, it's interesting because Pinker and these people, what they've done, it's really a wonderful trick, is that the Enlightenment happens. And then as soon as the Enlightenment manifests itself, all the dark aspects of what that implies come to the fore, right? Sacer-Masoch, Marquis de Sade, right away. There they are, like right, the worst of everything. Torture, you know, like all the worst sexual things, you know, this idea of power over others, and all of this is like just comes right out. And what Steven Pinker and them do is they just say, oh, that's the counter-enlightenment. And they have a weird strategy, which is to somehow connect the counter-enlightenment with the dark ages that they are opposing. So somehow it doesn't make any sense, but somehow they don't see like the rise of irrationality has nothing to do with the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, like read Thomas Aquinas, like read, they were the most rational people that have ever existed, right? It's just that they understood that reason came from first principles. They understood that the system of reason had axioms that could be seen as culminating up into something infinite, but they were extremely reasonable. Anyway, so that's their strategy, but it's a really annoying, it's very annoying and very silly. It's like, what is it, that book? What is it, that book against postmodernism? I forget the name of it. Understanding Postmodernism. You know, in that book, he basically places postmodernism into Kant. Like he has to put it all the way back in the Enlightenment in order to say, to kind of justify his position. But these two opposites are part of each other. You know, I pointed to the Goya's famous engraving that everybody's probably seen, which is, you see a man sleeping and you see all these kind of monsters coming out, and it says, it's written on it, the sleep of reason produces monsters. And I trying to point to that and say, there is a normal human cycle of being, which is awake and sleep. What Steven Pinker is telling us is, if you just stay awake all the time, then you won't have any problems. And then if you fall asleep, then I can get angry at you and say, hey, I told you to just stay awake. Like, if you just stay awake, then you'll have none of these problems. Like the monsters come when you fall asleep. So don't fall asleep. But this is absurd. That's not how human beings work. This is a complete misunderstanding of reality. And so to me, anyways, we'll see how it plays out. But for sure, right now we can see the reappearance of the monsters have been kind of bubbling up since World War II. Was like a reprieve because it was a massive shock. Like it was almost like it was a massive shock, massive human sacrifice, and then all of a sudden there was this reprieve which lasted a generation. But now here we are. We're at the end of that reprieve, and now we're seeing the monsters come out of the closet again. And you can scream reason all day long. That's just not how the world works.
And going beyond that kind of crude conception of progress and things like that, how might we return to a more coherent appreciation for time itself in what seems to be an age of constant distraction, especially through things like even cleverly designed technologies and things like that?
I mean, obviously, I think that, and I say this, but I struggle to do it myself because I'm just as modern as everybody else. But I think that reorganizing or recreating rhythm in our life is a way to do that, and you can do it in all kinds of ways, But I think that obviously doing it in a way that is connected in terms of religion is better, because the pattern that you enter into, the liturgical life or the liturgical pattern, it also scales and becomes the way in which you're bound to other people as well. So it's not just about, so some people do it like set up rhythms in their own life, like they meditate or they do this. And so they're able to recreate a rhythm which holds them together, which is a different perception of time. But I think that we need to do it in a way that also scales. And I think that prayer and liturgical celebration is the proper way to worship, basically. Because one of the problems, the opposite of distraction is worship, you could say. In a way, distraction is actually worship too. It's just a quick succeeding gods. It's like rotating gods, that kind of appear on your horizon. But I think that deliberate worship is the solution to the problem. Let's say that is focusing on something which is beyond the movement, beyond the spinning that we have, and just that, just actually focusing on something which is beyond the spinning for enough of your time and your attention will settle a lot of the chaos that is underneath.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jonathan. And some people from secularist backgrounds even have told me how much that they have been moved by your work. And I'll not say the name in case they don't want me to, but someone I mentioned to you before said that they were drawn to your work because of how you portray the Christian story as genuinely inclusive of all people, of all intellects and all backgrounds. It's a real and meaningful universalism. How does this universal Orthodox Christian faith differ from the phony universalism that we mentioned before, whether inside or outside the church?
Yeah. Well, I think that there is a recognition of the particular in Christianity, which is very important. And there is an idea that the body of the church, like let's say the body of your parish, your actual parish, that's it. Like that's where you encounter everything. And so the problem with a lot of universalism is that it deals in abstractions, and it deals in abstractions for reasons that are sometimes not the right reasons. So I would say, I might disagree, but I would say many universalists that I've met, they are universalists out of a kind of embarrassment, of being Christian. And so I'll give you an example. Like if someone asks, you probably had that experience all the time. Like someone comes up to you and asks you, well, what about Muslims? That's what they ask you. It's like, do you think that Muslims are also saved? And that question, that's the devil. That question is the devil, because why are you asking me this? What is your purpose? What are you trying to accomplish? Right? If I see myself as a sick person that is going to the hospital, and I'm going around and then let's say I have a way to get to the hospital, and then you come to me and you ask me, how do you get to the hospital? And I tell you, I'm like, this is how you get to the hospital. And then you ask me, well, isn't there another way to get to the hospital? And I'm like, what? What did you what are you trying to accomplish? Like, what is your purpose? It's a very subversive type of attitude. And so that's what I see in a lot of universal moves and a lot of people who want to have that type of stance because it makes them socially acceptable and it makes them palatable to the modern thinking. But it's not a good, I think people who are tempted by that, I think we need to kind of look at our own reasons for doing that. Like, why am I asking myself the question if others are saved? Like, ask yourself if you're saved. Like, ask yourself, what are you doing? Like, what are you urgently praying to God? Like, are you sacrificing your passions to something beyond you? Are you loving your neighbor? Is that what you're doing? But if you're asking me, like, I want to know if some child who dies in India, if they're saved, tell me what you think of that. And then they look at you smugly, like they've trapped you into some kind of like moral dilemma. That to me is the worst. And so the idea is that Christianity formulates its universalism, or its universal story from within the Christian story, and there's no other way to do it. And it does it through the manifestation of the incarnation as something which can reach to the end of the world and participate in bringing together all of reality. And we recognize that we don't know how that works completely. Like, and it's also not the specifics of how someone in somewhere else is going to be saved or not is really not my problem. Like, it's a dishonest question. It's a distraction to what you really need to ask, which is, do I love the people around me now? Like, am I involved in the community that I'm bound to? I don't know if I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Thank you, Jonathan. I think that's one of the things, like, I don't agree with a lot of what, say, Father Seraphim Rose says, but I think he's right about that kind of spirit of the age. And Jacques Ellul, I think, talks about that too, with this kind of world opinion, which is kind of pure abstraction, as it were, and actually dehumanizing in that respect then. And I think another thing that I read this article, The Scandal of Christ, by this nuclear scientist from Sri Lanka and a theologian, and he talked about those other worldviews don't even offer salvation. So it is a trick question even in that respect. They're offering maybe nirvana or things like that. It's not salvation that they even offer themselves within their own stories. So it's a ridiculous question on all those levels. And moving beyond that, then, if we might look at some positive stories. So I've been most moved by our mutual friend Thomas's story, who we mentioned before, and must thank you in part for that. And I appreciate that I've got to be a part of his journey, and I've actually learned a lot from him and been encouraged to become a better Christian through our friendship over the last few years now. And I want to ask you, what are some of the greatest stories that you've heard of people who've come to Christ through Jordan and yourself?
I mean, it's so funny because I'm really surprised at how many. A lot of the stories are actually quite similar, and I think it's the thing that pops out. I think the thing that comes out of the stories that I hear, if I can maybe point to an element which strikes me, is the surprise. It's the, here I am doing my thing, I'm somewhat miserable, or I'm struggling with meaning, and I'm kind of nihilistic, and then I'm surprised to find that I'm a Christian. It's like, what happened? And a lot of people are like, am I a Christian now? Like, what just happened? Like, what is this thing that happened to me? And I think that to me has really been the most surprising and kind of joyful to talk to people who have had that experience, which is that it's almost like they followed these little breadcrumbs and they didn't realize what was going on. And by the time they realized, it was too late. Their whole worldview had changed, and now there was no turning back. And that to me has been very exciting to see. And people from all over the world, strangely, a lot of people from northern countries, and then Canada and in US especially. So a lot of you, it's always kind of, it's a lot of young people too in their 20s that are kind of pulled into. And I talked to a guy recently, I won't say his name, but he's a catechumen right now in the Orthodox Church. And it was funny because he was almost kind of doubtful of what was going on in himself, because he said, I feel like I'm in some kind of secret club right now. It's like, I feel like I'm part of something that nobody can see, but that's happening. Kind of like I'm in the cool group. I'm in the elite, or not the elite, but I'm on the point of what's happening in culture, in a movement that no one can see yet, but that is coming. And he's like, I'm worried that I'm doing things for the wrong reasons because I want to be in that cool group. And I just thought it was really hilarious, because like, who would have thought that some like shaggy guy in his 20s wearing like a plaid shirt could tell you that, like even 10 years ago, could say like, I'm going to become a Christian and I feel like I'm in this really cool, super elite group that is discovering this and no one knows about it. And it's just like, it was really amazing. It was really a wonderful surprise.
Thank God. That's amazing. And regarding then yourself again, Jonathan, what are some of the central ways that you've been formed and reformed in Orthodoxy over the years, coming from that evangelical background and so on?
I would say the two major ways is mostly obviously like a kind of metanoia that I experienced in reading the Fathers, and kind of this change of mind, let's say. And that was actually the easy part. I mean, the harder part is the embodying of that. That is a lot harder. My goodness. And, living an Orthodox life in the modern world is already very challenging. But then also doing it as a kind of newbie, as someone who is, who doesn't come from that tradition, I think that's been the hardest. And it's still something that I struggle with, in terms of really having that. It's like the things I talk about, in many ways, I'm trying to convince myself too. I hope people understand that I'm not speaking from a place of like enlightened peace and just, this illumination. I really am trying to embody these things really in my life, through prayer, through remembrance, through, connecting to the stories of the saints. And all of these are strange still to me too. And so the Bible is easier because I grew up with it. And so that I feel like I can really live in that story, but everything else, although I recognize it and find it very powerful and beautiful, it's a little harder to embody. So I think that's the transformation, which then proceeded from my first metanoia and is still going on now. Like it's still becoming, in certain aspects, certain practices, which at first Orthodox kind of engage in, and that you just think, oh, well, that's not for me. And then slowly you start to understand what they're for, and you start to understand the kind of balm that they're playing, or the kind of medicine that they're applying. And you're like, you know what? Actually, I think I need to do this. I think I need to do this, not because for some just kind of external moral reason, but because I can see almost like the therapy that it's bringing to me, like the balm that it's offering me,
Yeah, that's beautiful. I feel your pain with that. And Father Schmemann has been really, really helpful, even in his works, in pointing to what you're talking about, the treasure. He always focuses on Christ as the treasure, and that's what it's ultimately about, and not to get caught up in this kind of ideological conception of orthodoxism, or whatever I think he calls it in his journals. Yeah. As a teacher,
because a lot of people get disappointed, because if you're not careful, orthodoxy is messy. Like it's messy, and you have to understand that it's messy. There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of the politics. There's a lot of things happening, and you will have bad experiences. Like it's going to happen. One day you're going to go to confession, and you're going to stand up from that confession. You'll be like, what happened? Like, who is this priest? What did he just say to me? Like, what the heck? It's like everybody's going to have those kinds of experiences. And if you're not careful, and if you idealize things too much, then those can really be they can be a turnoff. But if you see it more kind of holistically, and you see it like as this kind of slow, messy healing that's going on in your life, then it's easier to take on.
Yeah, I'm in and certainly agree with that. And I want to ask you next, because as a teacher in Ireland here, I think it would be amazing if we could introduce children to your work in the symbolic world early and attend to them as whole persons rather than our dominant secularist model. How do we then begin to inculcate an awareness and discernment of some of these patterns in schools and in our communities then?
Yeah. I think that it's probably not like for young children, it's not a good idea to try to, you don't need to tell the children what things mean, especially when they're young, but you definitely need to expose them to the stories. I think that that's what we need to do, is rather like, as people who understand the role of fairy tales, of stories, of myth, and the Bible stories and the stories of the saints, then I think that exposing the children to those stories and making those, let's say, the stories that they consume, rather than just the stuff on TV or the kind of popular culture, then I think that's already doing a great job in creating that. And I would say also celebrating, like not stuff. It depends where you live. At some places it's become harder to celebrate. Like we just have lost the tendency to celebrate Christmas, to Easter, to remember Pentecost, to remember the feast days. And just remembering them, or just mentioning them, even just at the dinner table or whatever, and say, or just to remember them, so that it becomes like this pattern in which they live. I think that's the best thing you can do for kids, especially young kids. And then as they get older, then one of the things that I would do with my kids is I wouldn't tell them what something means, but I would ask them questions like, if like, let's say I'm reading a fairy tale, and then there's something in the fairy tale, like there's an apple that someone eats and then they die, let's say Snow White. And then I would ask them, what other story do you know where that happens? Do you know another story where someone eats a fruit and then they die? And then they would be thinking and be like, yeah, Adam and Eve. That's a story where they do that. Is there a connection between the two, Dad? And you don't even have to spell it out so much, but just, I would always kind of point to these connections and just say, did you notice that for a certain trope, like especially if your kids go through a lot of fairy tales, at some point you can't avoid the tropes. Like, did you notice that it's always the godmother? Like, why is it the godmother? Why is it the stepmother? Sorry. And so that kind of thing, I think, can be helpful when they see patterns first. And as they see patterns, then the meanings will start to appear more and more, and they'll notice them on their own.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. And in the past, you've spoken movingly about Christ and his parables. Can you tell us a bit about that whole way of speaking and how we're to attend to what God's revealing in this unusual way, at least unusual by our modern secularist and very didactic biases, I suppose?
Well, I think the best way to approach scripture, I would say, is first of all, is to approach it typologically. And this is really counterintuitive for moderns, because it's really about perceiving and participating in patterns. And so, like, let's say, how people get excited about Marvel superheroes, and when they read Marvel superheroes and they have crossovers where this Marvel superhero appears in the other Marvel superhero thing, and people get all excited because they have these cosmologies, and they interconnect, and they have points of contact with each other. And I think that is way more exciting than like telling people what to do. Like, they're just telling people how to be a good little boy, right? I mean, you do need to tell your kids how to be a good little boy, but the excitement of seeing patterns is actually what makes us human. And so to understand scripture typologically is a way for people to kind of find joy and beauty in the stories, and be amazed at how interconnected scripture is. And I think that that's probably the best way to kind of reawaken excitement about these things, rather than them just being, some external finger wagging or whatever. So I think that's the way to do it. And in terms of the parables, it's just an extension. It's just an extension of that. Christ's parables are very rarely about morals. You can try to make them about that, but you're going to run into a lot of problems. That's why, if you notice, like there are some parables that no one tells because people don't know what to do with them, because they aren't simple moral lessons. It's like the parable of the wedding feast, where the important people refuse to come to the wedding feast. So they go out into the street and they invite all the people from the outside to come to the wedding feast. But then one person doesn't come dressed for the feast and gets thrown out into hell, basically. It's like, nobody tells that parable because they don't know what to do with it. It's like that parable is just like, anyway. So I think that understanding that what Christ is telling us, first and foremost, is he's tracing a pattern of being. He's telling you the shape of reality before he's giving you a moral lesson. And there is often a moral lesson you can get from it. But there is a higher meaning there, that if you can't access that, some of the things he says are just going to be gibberish to you, or just going to be so weird that you'll pretend like they don't exist, which is what a lot of Christians do.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I want to speak with you next, if we may, about a few of your upcoming projects. So you mentioned recently, I believe, about your forthcoming book. Can you tell us a bit about what to expect and what you hope to achieve with that?
One of the things I've been working on for years, is 10 years ago, my brother and I wrote a screenplay called God's Dog. And it's a very loose retelling of the legend of St. Christopher, very, very loose, like in terms of it's what it is. It's really a story that is trying to dive into Christian cosmology and tell a story from that perspective, as if the Christian cosmology was really like a mythological backdrop for a story. It's very similar to what you see in Paradise Lost or in Dante, but then more recently, that kind of writing has actually been taken up by very anti-Christian people, and you see that in Neil Gaiman, and you see it in Alan Moore, and those kinds of writers. And so we tried to create a story that seemed subversive at the outset, but that ultimately was not in any way, because it has monsters, it has a dog-headed man, it has a Leviathan and giants and all these kind of weird stuff. All the weird stuff in scripture and in tradition, we just kind of jammed into one story. And so that'll be coming out this year. I don't know exactly when, because we're still working out the art. But that's one of the big projects that's kind of on the horizon. And I do want to write a book on symbolism, but it hasn't. It's like I'm just too busy right now. It'll come.
Yeah, wonderful. And regarding the Orthodox Arts Journal, then would you like to tell us a bit about that, what you've done and what you hope to do with it now in the future?
Well, the Orthodox Art Journal was started by Andrew Gould and I in 2012, I think. And at first, I was really, really involved, kind of until the Jordan Peterson thing. And to be honest, for the past 3-4 years, I've been much less involved, which is kind of too bad. But at the same time, we still put out articles once in a while. I really hope that it would be a place for a kind of resurgence of liturgical art. But at this particular time, I don't put a lot of energy into it, sadly. But it's the resources there are wonderful. If you want to discover about traditional art, if you want to discover about kind of how it's embodied in symbolism, there are hundreds and hundreds of articles there that kind of deal with that.
Yeah, amazing. And I also love Jesus the Imagination, which you contributed to for Dr. Michael Martin too. That was I sent a drawing, I think, or was it an image of a carving? And so I didn't write for the journal. He just asked me if I could send in an image, and so I sent in a carving. That's great. Anyway. And why should people know the likes of George Cardis then, and Elena? I don't really know how to pronounce Elena's second name. It's Romanian, like
Morariu.
And what's best about their work for you then?
Well, I think that what we're seeing this in Greece and in Romania. We see it in Russia. We're seeing it in America too. We're seeing top level artists who are giving themselves to Orthodox arts. And so there is, on the one hand, there's a kind of frenetic energy which is there, sometimes experimental, sometimes too experimental, it's possible. But there's a kind of bubbling inside the liturgical arts that have been going on for about a decade. And I think that it's interesting because it is really recreating a living art. It's a communal art. It's something which is engaging scripture, taking all of that very seriously, the tradition of scripture. And so someone like Cordes, for example, who is more on the experimental side, but Cordes is a absolute master in terms of drawing. I mean, he really has, let's say, internalized the language of Byzantine art. And so someone like that, to watch him draw, to see him make his painting is quite astounding. And it gives you hope, kind of gives you hope for art in the church. So
yeah, amazing. And what are some of your own favorite artistic pieces from history, and why do they resonate with you so much?
I'm definitely a big fan of the Middle Ages. I think that let's say there's a moment like what's known as Norman Sicily is a moment that I really appreciate, because I feel like something we can do right now, because one of the problems of the modern world is a kind of mixture, a kind of confusion, you could say, where even with the internet, because we're so bombarded with like all these different stimuli that aren't related, that are completely, there's a sense in which the narrative or the pattern can break down because it's too much, and there's everything. But I feel like in that moment, there's also a possibility of creating synthetic arts that are capable of actually joining disparate elements together into coherence. And as an example of that, Norman Sicily is a moment where that really happened, where the best of Western medieval art, the kind of strong graphic element that was there in Western manuscript tradition, for example, gets joined with kind of the glory of Byzantine mosaics and the color of Byzantine mosaics, and at the same time joined with the genius of Islamic patterns. And so it's like those churches are really a testimony to what can be done in a moment of mixture to create synthesis rather than give in to a kind of fragmentary idea of reality.
Yeah, amazing. Somebody that completely, I think, contradicts that is Terrence Malick. And I know Thomas, and I love him. Thomas got me really into him. I want to ask you about him just to satisfy my own curiosity. Well, what do you think of Malick and his work?
I haven't seen, everybody tells me to see, I haven't seen his last movie. And so I saw True of Life, I remember, and I found it difficult. Like I find that I haven't seen the latest one, so I don't know. Look, I have to see it. But I know that what I found difficult in what I've seen of him is that I feel like narrative is a really important aspect of Christianity. And I feel like he kind of gives up on narrative in a way, or at least that there's kind of a broken narrative or a very diffuse narrative. And so I'm not sure, but like I said, I haven't also seen that many of his movies, because the ones that I've seen have not really grabbed my attention.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sorry.
No, A Hidden Life I watched first, and it blew me away. But I think he only returned to using a script for that movie, actually, because he hadn't used it, as you say, for the other ones. So I think you would maybe enjoy it more.
Everybody says see A Hidden Life, so I will watch it just for you, so that I can have a way of interpreting.
Thank you, Jonathan. I know we're kind of closing in our time, but can I ask you one more thing, or do you want to?
Sure. Yeah.
In advance.
Yeah.
Okay. So, something that I think is real, I'm curious about after reading Dr. Richard Beck and following your work and hearing what some of the things that the Lord of Spirits podcast guys are doing. I wonder, can you help us to understand this tie between our fear of death and our kind of hero projects, as it were, and demons? Because Richard Beck, for example, and those guys on the podcast seem to be hitting on the same point in different ways by sort of suggesting that psychologically and theologically that these hero projects, which promise this illusion of immortality, are actually false gods and perhaps even demons. And I wonder, could you help us maybe join some of the dots there?
I'm not sure about the first author you mentioned. I'm not aware of them. With the Lord of Spirits, one of the things they're tapping into is a very ancient story, and it's, I don't know if it's so much the idea of the hero project. It's mostly about the idea that techne, or that this kind of technological society that we live in, that somehow it has value in itself, and that somehow it is going to be the thing that will save us. And what they've been pointing back to is the idea that in the book of Enoch and in the tradition surrounding the kind of more apocalyptic vision of the flood, there's a sense in which the demons are the ones that taught the sciences to humans. And they, just like in the Greek tradition of the Titan who brings fire to people. And so the idea is that there's a kind of, you see it in scripture, it's already there in scripture, in the descendants of Cain, where it's the descendants of Cain that develop technology and develop civilization. But in doing so, they actually increase the fall, and they increase conflict and animosity, isolation. And this leads to death. It leads to the flood. And so what they're trying to point to is that this is something which seems to be going on right now, the same kind of approach. And we're actually seeing, I would say, people are going to freak out because maybe they won't know what I'm talking about, but we're seeing demons reappear on the horizon, and they're using different methods to kind of, let's say, kind of reintegrate the world. And one does seem to be even something like artificial intelligence. And so we seem to be building idols right now, and those idols are being possessed by corporate beings that are out of control, that we don't control, and that we end up worshiping. And so I think that's maybe that, I don't know if that's what you mean, but I think that's definitely something that is happening. And the idea, you can see it, like people take for granted that somehow technology is just a good. And you see it all the time. And they think that being human is making technology. Like, that's hilarious. I mean, it's hilarious that, I mean, I don't actually disagree that it's part of what it means to be human, but that's not what makes someone human. There's an amazing quote from Tolkien in his book on fairies, where he says, when he read these kind of science fiction stories that were there at his time, he said he didn't understand the interest of them. He said all these people, they all had the same horrible passions and, like, disastrous, let's say, spiritual reality. They just went a lot faster and had bigger guns. It's like, this is actually, what are we doing? Like, we're giving ourselves like infinite power, and we're just running out of wisdom. We're running out of that which is actually which is actually what makes us human. So in that sense, you can see this kind of, and it's showing itself in all kinds of storytelling. Like the trope of the Watchers and the trope of the Nephilim is now everywhere in popular culture. It's like, it's just popping up in all these different stories. So
yeah, thanks for that, Jonathan. Two things I should say. Malik in his movie Hidden Life touches on those things.
Okay.
So it's funny that we're talking about it. And number two, then just I should say that we've given people that black pill. Your work is a huge white pill that people should follow. And I appreciate so much talking with you today, and hope you have a lovely evening over there in Canada now.
It was great to meet you, Mark.
You too, Jonathan. God bless you.